squatting 500 pounds, front squatting over 440 pounds, being able to jerk something like 440 pounds. That's the definition of being skinny strong. Ryan McDonald is exactly that, and we're going to teach you exactly how you can achieve being skinny strong and whether or not it's possible. And we're going to start right now. When we're talking about being skinny strong, we've got to look at immediately, what does that mean? Okay, so oftentimes when we see athletes come into the gym and they tend to be a little bit taller, they have longer legs. Someone like Ryan McDonald, who was known as Sticks, coined by NFL linebacker Jan Johnson. These are individuals that tend to be, when you first look at them, someone who's not as prone to gaining massive amounts of strength. Okay, so it's somebody that you're looking at like, hey, that kid's really skinny. How strong can they really get? You know, they're going to be the hard gainers. They're oftentimes termed that. Whether or not they actually like lifting weights, we'll see. You know, and I think that that's something that is a stigma that's constantly put on kids that tend to be skinny. That if you have a skinny kid who's coming into the gym, we've got to figure out, one, how to get them to enjoy lifting weights. Okay. Two, we have to figure out how we can help them make as much progress as possible and minimize any potential injuries that we might end up seeing. Okay, so a couple examples here at Garage Strength is that if we've had someone come through that has really, really long legs. So Nick Singleton, who's a starting running back at Penn State, he was termed, and still, I was just at Penn State last week, is still sort of considered skinny strong, even to the point where Chuck Losey, the head strength coach, was like, Nick's arms are still pretty small. Like, they're pretty skinny, even though he can bench, 430 pounds. His legs are so long. You know, there's an issue there. He doesn't look as big as he actually is once you're like sort of close and in person with him, or you get hit by him. So one of the big factors there that we have to look at when you're analyzing that skinny strength is that typically it will be someone who's longer limbed. And I believe personally, when you have a longer legged athlete, you have to get them to squat as much as possible at a very early age. That's like the number one big factor around skinny strength, I believe, is that we've got to get them to squat really well. And when you have an athlete who has long legs and they can squat really well, they become freaks and they cultivate that skinny strength. And so even to the point where we've had Jake Horse, who's a very, very tall lifter for his weight class. So he was a 73K lifter, snatched 145 kilos, which is about 320 pounds. What ended up happening with Jake is that we developed a lot of hypertrophy in his upper body because his limbs were so long. And that was a key factor to that skinny strength. Okay, we had to lead into these areas of hypertrophy, and we had to get about 1.1 to 1.2 times more reps of hypertrophy work when compared to an individual who isn't as tall or isn't as skinny. Okay, athletes that tend to be a little bit huskier, it's a little bit easier to put to make those strength gains because they just have a little bit more mass. And I think that's a really, really important factor. Also, I believe the skinny strength athletes also tend to have longer arms. I'm thinking about someone like Brandon George. Okay, this is an athlete that we've had. He's got a 6'10 wingspan. So at an early age, when he came in 7th grade, started to train, we had to start to focus on a lot of big time strength movements and just recognize that the time horizon is probably going to be much longer. Okay, it's going to be much longer to make these specific gains. And so our rep rate of improvement might be a little bit more lengthened. We might have to get more reps done on a daily basis to try and achieve the same amount of strength improvements in the same time continuum relative to another athlete his age that's not as thin, not as skinny. And so what I wanted to do was sort of paint that picture that you've got a kid who's tall, you've got a kid who's got longer limbs. You know, you're thinking about Bambi running around just following, you see a deer or a horse when they're first born, right? They've got super long legs. Their myelin sheathing haven't been as developed yet. They're sort of falling all over the place. It's going to take a little bit longer time for them to truly develop, which actually with Brandon, you'll see is that that's sort of how his career followed, is that he was clearly a good football player, became a starting linebacker at Pitt. Didn't get the invite to the combine, but then ended up having one of the top 7 best pro days in the history of the NFL. Okay, because it just takes a little bit longer time for them to develop long term. So what I want to do is paint that picture. You have these longer limbed athletes. We've got to recognize that they're probably not going to be the best squatters. They probably should be pretty good deadlifters in most cases. We've got to figure out what movements they're not good at. What is their sport that they're focusing on? If we have a skinny, strong kid that's a swimmer, we've really got to focus on developing their lat strength, their shoulder strength, and this is going to be hard when they have such longer arms. And even if you have somebody who, let's say a wrestler who's got longer arms, it's going to be hard to increase their bench press because of the range of motion is so dramatic. And when they're younger and they haven't hit puberty yet, that can delay things quite a bit more. Now, the case study that I wanted to provide you guys is around a weightlifter. Now, I don't want you to click off if you're an anti-weightlifter, because I want you to hear these squat numbers. This individual, whose nickname was Sticks, from Jan, as I mentioned, can back squat over 500 pounds. He hit a back squat double at 495 pounds. He's 18 years old and he weighs 178 pounds. He literally just doubled 225 kilos like 3 days ago, and he weighed 81 kilos. He snatched 1.8 times body weight. Okay, he's clean and jerk 2.28 times body weight. He's front squatted 215 kilos, which is 215 kilos is what, 460. So 460 pounds, he's 18. That's a good back squat for a kid in high school. That's a great back squat for a kid in high school. And he's front squatting this, weighing 178 pounds. So, and he's deadlifted 227 kilos. So when we're looking and hearing those numbers, and then we paint this picture of Ryan, okay, in this case, I want to look at it and say, okay, over an 8-year time frame, okay, of training, we've got to look at his initial body weight. I think his first lifting competitions, he was 33 kilos. So clearly there's going to be a period from 10 years to 13, 14 years where he's just starting to hit puberty. So things are going to take a lot longer. And I think the most important part with a younger kid who is taller and super, super skinny is we got to focus on the big aspects here. We're still going to do hypertrophy work with dumbbells. We're still going to do hypertrophy work with body weight work, like meaning just learning the movement patterns, doing push-ups, doing body weight squats, doing, dowel rod overhead squats, learning the technique of Olympic lifts, learning how to box jump, learning how to do walking lunges, things like this. Okay, really, really important body control. So we've got hypertrophy work from high reps. We've got technique that we're learning. Okay, and then I really like to think about pushing back squats. I'll use my own son as an example. Lincoln is really, really long-legged, especially right now. He's 13. He just is starting to hit puberty, and he just single leg squatted 115 kilos for a triple. He can back squat 125 kilos ass to grass. This is an example of a kid who is longer limbed, and we want to push them to be able to squat really well early. Same thing with Nick Singleton. Okay, so when we go back to Ryan, training frequency at an early age, basically from the point of 10 to 14 years of age, he was training between 4 and 5 days a week. Okay, so that's an example of where it's not normal. Okay, most kids would say 3 to 4 days a week they're going to train regularly. That's fine, and you can still get a kid skinny strong by training 3 to 4 days a week. And if you're older and you're somebody who struggles with certain things because you are taller, you're longer, and you're skinnier, I would recommend right off the bat that you've got to look at it and say, what body weight stuff can I do on my own time when I'm not at the gym that can increase hypertrophy and increase actual strength patterns? Now, getting into the specific numbers here, when Ryan started with us, okay, let's say he weighed about 33 kilos, okay, and his best snatch was around 25 kilos. His best clean and jerk was around 40 kilos, back squat around 50 kilos. And those numbers tend to be a bit tighter, obviously, just because of the absolute number of weight, amount of weight that they're going to be able to lift when you're a younger kid. Okay, so during this time frame, we could see the snatch go from 25 kilos to 146 kilos. Okay, so that's a 121 kilo increase. So that's going from, snatching 55 pounds to snatching 323 pounds. Now, big factor here is that we're going through puberty. So there's going to be an expedited timeline. Okay, and I want to get into some of this stuff later, where once you get through puberty, there's still going to be some things that we can do as a key takeaway for you to improve if you're somebody who tends to be skinnier. Okay, now, If you're looking at that on a yearly basis, the snatch was about a 15 kilo increase per year. The clean and jerk would be around 18 kilo increase per year. The back squat would be about a 22 kilo increase per year. That's if we're looking at this from that 10 years to 18 years old. Okay. But most of that strength really was expedited over the last 4 years. Once you're stable, once your movement patterns are stable, once your mindset is a little bit more dialed in, once your understanding of movement patterns improves, that first 4 years is laying the foundation. Now that next 4 years is like, all right, let's really, really try and cultivate all this strength, cultivate all your power. And that's a big factor here, is that when we're looking at how we lay out an actual strength training system, okay, and we want to create some type of strength training system that can completely change the path of your career. That's what we've done inside of Peak Strength. If you go into Peak Strength, you can click the link down below in our description. You can head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. All of this stuff that we're talking about today, all of the data, all the information is inside of Peak Strength. We've used these tactics here at Garage Strength, and now we're making it available to you guys to have in your pocket to become freak athletes. So you can start doing this work today. It's a longer time horizon. You've got to start, you've got to contribute, you got to get the reps in. That's what it all comes down to, is you've got to get those reps in. Start today inside of Peak Strength. Now back to Ryan. What ends up happening is that our training volume as far as weightlifting is concerned, and I'm going to compare this to football, is that if you have somebody, I'm going to compare this with Nick Singleton, is that if we're looking at this and we're saying as a weightlifter, he's snatching about 20 to 25 reps a day. He's typically training 5 to 6 sessions here, and in now since he's been about 16, 3 sessions at home. Okay, so he's getting 8 to 9 sessions a week. Okay, so that's 20 to 25 reps per day usually. Sometimes I would argue it would probably be a little bit higher. His clean, he gets 15 to 20 reps per day. So let's say for 5 to 6 days a week, he's getting, those 20 reps of cleans in. His strength work, and this is where the big stuff is going to be, is like strength and hypertrophy. And this is where you're going to see a good carryover, good comparison to other sports, is that he's typically going to do 15 to 25 reps of strength work per day. If we have somebody like Nick, okay, he would train 4 days a week. Nick would typically do around 30 to 35 reps of strength work every single day. So if we were benching, he was going to do 35 to 50 reps. If he was squatting, he was going to do 30 to 35 reps. Okay, so if we were doing, and I'm thinking strength work as bench press, back squat, front squat, single leg squat, pull-ups, that's strength work. If you're somebody who's a weightlifter and you're cleaning, the weightlifter that's cleaning is going to get 15 to 20 reps per day. Nick might only clean at the time as a football player twice a week, but he's still in a weekly time frame would be getting between 40 and 50 reps per week of cleans. So some of that would be speed work, some of that would be technique work, some of that would be strength work, okay, like meaning a little bit heavier. Now, if we're going back to Ryan and assuming that he's getting about 8 sessions per week, he's going to be getting about 140 to 175 reps per week of snatch. And that's recognizing that he is training in the morning. So that's a little outrageous. That's a very, very high number of reps. But I'm going to tie this back to somebody who tends to be a bit more normal. Okay, his clean, if he's doing 15 to 20 reps of cleans per day, and he's getting those 8 to 9 sessions in, now we're looking at 135 reps per week. And then his strength work, if we're looking at 20 reps, his accessories is going to be about 75 reps per day. Now we're talking about 160 reps of his strength work per week. And then we're looking at 600 reps of hypertrophy work. Now, the 600 reps of hypertrophy work is the big factor. And this is going to be where you're looking at 50 to 80% intensity. Some of this stuff is banded. A lot of this stuff is body weight. This would include glute ham raises, reverse hypers, ab wheel, dumbbell benches, push-ups, dips. That's included a little bit of a crossover. And the big factor here is that if you're a skinny, strong athlete, and from what we've seen in developing these skinny, strong athletes, someone like Nick, someone like Brandon George, someone like Luke Payton, who now plays at UMass as a left tackle, another individual who had 6'8", super skinny in high school, but could clean 275 pounds. A lot of that work goes back to what type of hypertrophy work can we really do, okay, to make joints more stable. So at an early age, the biggest factor here, and looking at this data and this information from Ryan, is that the biggest factor comes down to the foundational hypertrophy and accessory work, okay, and then what type of strength work can we do. And if we can spend 2 to 4 years of really dialing in strength in the triceps, strength in the shoulders, so more so the traps and delts, but more so the traps, okay, strength in the lower back, strength in the hamstring, strength in the quads. Typically longer, skinnier kids will have a little bit more knee issues and lower back issues than a kid who's not as long, okay, not as skinny. And so we need to build this massive foundation so that they have this joint stability, because when they have joint stability, now they can apply more force more effectively in a more coordinated manner. And when they can apply that more force through a stable joint, now they get stronger. Okay, so the big factor there is that we're recognizing that the strength of the joint really comes back to developing for the first, when we talk about Ryan, those first 10 years old to 14 years old, it's being as stable as possible. Okay, and it's creating that through plyometrics, it's creating that through hypertrophy work, it's creating that through technique work and pauses, a lot of isometrics. Okay, pauses in the split, pause front squats, pause back squats. And when we can take a joint that now becomes much more stable and much more, much tighter, there's greater co-contractions, stiffer, I guess is the technical term. There's greater co-contractions in that joint. And when the co-contractions become united, that's when skinny kids can get freaking strong. Okay. The reason why they're not usually strong at an early age is because they're growing and adapting. Grow more, adapt. Grow more before adaptation happens, and then that's when they're a little wobbly. That's when they're wonky. That's why you see, somebody who's like a basketball player struggle with strength gains, because they don't want to do the necessary hypertrophy work at an early point, at early stage. So the big focus here is that we're trying to emphasize long-term development to get that skinny strength. It's not just going to magically appear. We've got to hone in on that long-term development and base that off of the key lifts, the key foundational movements. Okay. The next thing, we want to look at high frequency as much as possible, 3 to 4 to 5 days a week. I always talk about this. People will say Nick Singleton was a freak. Well, he was a freak because he was willing to train 4 to 5 days a week. Even during COVID, when he was in 9th and 10th grade, he would be at home training in his garage 4 to 5 days a week, doing push-ups, doing dips, doing cleans, doing front squats. And that's the big factor here, is that we've got to focus on doing that work. And then also from the high frequency, when we have people who are doing high volume training, their technique improves. So they get more proficient at a movement like a clean or a snatch or a front squat or a back squat or a single leg squat or a pull up or a bench press, whatever it might be. Their technique gets better because they're able to get more and more reps in. When you get more reps in, now that neural adaptation occurs faster than it otherwise would have. And that mind-muscle action between the brain and the muscles is a little bit more controlled. It's a little bit more dialed in because of that. And then we want to place a little bit more emphasis on strengthening the lower back. We know they're going to be better pullers than most kids because they're longer limbed, but their lower back might be a little bit weaker. So we've got to make sure that that's stronger. And then that weekly volume, we have to establish. If you get a high school football player that comes in, and let's say that they do 25 cleans. I'm going to do some quick math here. They do 25 cleans, and then they do 30 squats, right? And then they do accessories. Let's say that they do 3 accessories that each one they're ended up doing 240 total reps. Okay, so that's one day here. So we're looking at this and we're saying, okay, now we're sitting at 200, let's say 300 total reps. If they could train 3 to 4 days a week, they got 300 total reps. Now they're going to turn that 300 total reps, if they're training 4 days a week, to 1,200 total reps. And if we know that there's a rep rate of improvement that we know based off of taking someone's bench press from 135 to 225, it usually takes a certain number of reps to increase 10 pounds. Okay. If we know that that exists based off of our benchmark system and our milestones, now we know that the sooner that we can get those reps done, the stronger they get, the faster they get, then the more developed they are. Then when they get to the high school level, the collegiate level, now they're even stronger than people, than other kids that are normal limb length. So the big factor on that, and we haven't even touched yet on the nutritional aspect. So we've got to think through this and say, okay, we're looking at ages 10 to 12, foundational technique work, okay, lighter loads, hypertrophy, and plyometrics, okay? Then we're looking at 12 to 15, 12 to 14. We can keep increasing volume. We want to focus on this technique. Now it becomes highly consistent. And then once we're going 16 to 19, that's when we can start to push things a little bit more with the load. And that's where you see with Ryan being able to hit 8 singles at 130 kilos, 132 kilos. His technique's dialed in. His positions are better. And because his positions are better, he's able to maintain that skinny strength, right? And this factors back into, this is one thing I want to bring up real quick here with nutrition, is that most skinny strength kids that we have come in, most of them understand the gains are going to be harder because they have a training partner who tends to be, a bit more normal size and can get stronger faster. And because of that, most of these kids tend to be wired mentally as a type 1 athlete, a Zen style athlete. So now they start to think through this and they can understand, like, okay, I have to do more work. I have to hold better positions. I have to eat better. And if you're new to this channel, Nick Singleton is a starting running back at Penn State. He's somebody who's likely going to get drafted in the first or second round next year. Brandon George, he's probably going to get drafted by the time this video goes out. He will have likely been drafted this year. These are individuals who, by the age of 12, 13, 14 years old, were bought in to proper nutrition. And I think that's another big factor, is that because they're so long-limbed and because they tend to be thinner, they need to eat a bit more protein. They need to eat a bit more carbohydrates. They really have to dial in with that nutrition so that they can actually recover as effectively as possible, because they will be more sore than most kids. When you have a longer range of motion, you have greater eccentric movements, right? Greater eccentric capacity is occurring, which can lead to, in some cases, more fatigue and more soreness then. And so we need to make sure that these same individuals, I would recommend for every pound of body weight that they're eating like 1.2 grams of protein, maybe even a little more, but 1.2 is a good starting point with somebody who tends to be, 300 to 400 grams of carbs a day. And that's going to help them with their recovery. And what's fun with these kids, and I'm even thinking about one of our swimmers, Vera Robertson, who's from Michigan. She's a multiple time state place winner, and her sister Ella, who's a 7-time All-American this year at MIT. These are very tall athletes. Vera, Ella, they can bust out 10 to 15 pull-ups, but they also, because they're so long-limbed, they had to be super bought into their nutrition at an early age. They have to be focusing on eating good protein. Let's say they eat, again, something similar, about 1 gram per pound of body weight of protein. Again, 250 to 400 grams of carbohydrates. And now with these athletes, because they are more of the Zen style individuals, they're more focused on recovery. They're more focused on the things that matter. They're more focused on doing mobility work at home because they know they have to get those extra reps. So I want to go through this with the key takeaways of somebody who's watching this. Let's say a 25-year-old is just getting into strength training, and they're somebody who wants, they tend to be skinnier, they tend to be longer, taller, and they want to get stronger, you've got to look at it and say, okay, let's go through a 2-year time horizon that by the time I'm 27, I want to get my bench press from 225 to 315. Okay, well, we've got to make sure that we're hitting 50 reps of bench press a week, okay? Or probably more than that, probably around 70, okay? Because I would say in one session, I would try to get you to 35 to 40 in one session. So if you're going to bench twice a week, we should probably be doing around 70 plus reps per week of bench. You know, if you want to get your deadlift from, 300 to 405, once a week we hit big deadlift sessions. Let's say we're doing 15 to 25 reps of deads. And then the second strength leg day of the week, we want to do more unilateral work. We want to do single leg squats because that's where you're going to be. That's your wheelhouse. The unilateral work is going to be your wheelhouse. And if we can have you target things like single leg squats, that's going to build up that posterior chain further and strengthen that lower back. Now, with this theoretical 25 to 27-year-old who is skinny strong, we've got to get extra about 1.1 times the reps on hypertrophy that a normal size athlete would get. So we've got to make sure that we're getting those, anywhere from 300 to 330 reps per session. So you might do, let's say in the hypertrophy work, so accessories, let's say you're doing 80 to 150 reps of tricep work on day 1 or day 2 of your upper body day. And then on day 4, your next upper body day, you might do another 150 to 200 reps of hypertrophy work. And we got to dial in on wherever those weak points are. And so if that accessory work is neglected, you're not going to make those foundational gains. You're not going to make those big time strength gains because there's no stability in the joints to apply force. Okay. And so if we want to work towards that 1.8 times body weight snatch, taking Ryan for an example, and we want to work towards that 2.28 times clean and jerk. He's clean and jerked 185 kilos. Okay. If we want to work towards that 2.8 times body weight back squat, we've got to push those lifts early. Okay, we've got to push the squats early. We have to prioritize those and do them frequently. And the variations that I would say end up being a huge factor. So the big factor that we have to look at is that if we're an individual trying to make these gains, trying to get to that 1.8 times body weight snatch, which probably won't happen, is absolutely insanity. That number is insanely high, right? If we're trying to get to that point, we have to recognize the importance of that technical work. Then we're going to compare this. If we've got a weightlifter here they're going to be the best example of the skinny strength individual. Okay. And that strength that they gain from hitting big snatches, hitting big cleans, hitting big squats will carry over to their hypertrophy work eventually. When Ryan is 22 to 25 years old, that's when we're going to start to see that big time muscular development. That's what happened with Jake Horst. Okay. By the time Jake was about 23 to 24, we started to see his shoulders fill out. Now the issue was his legs never filled out, right? Because he's so tall, so long for his body weight. If we're comparing now Ryan, the weightlifter, to a football player like Nick or Brandon, we will see shoulder development occur around 22 to 24 years old. Okay. And the difference here is that the hypertrophy work and accessories will actually be more prevalent with the football player. Okay. The strength work will be pretty close, pretty similar, but the daily training for the weightlifter will be higher. So on a weekly basis, the strength work will be a little bit higher, but on a daily basis, it's going to be pretty similar. When we're looking at snatch and clean work, typically the weightlifter will snatch or clean in the same session, whereas our football guys will only do one of those in the same session. Okay, so if we're taking someone like George Parkinson, another athlete that we have right now who's a freshman, he's very, very tall, but he has a little bit more of a bigger build, even though he's like 6'5" and he's only 15. George can handle that volume now because he's been in the system for a while. And so that's the big factor too, is that we've got to recognize the high speed movements like a clean or a snatch are really the basis for being skinny strong. So a lot of coaches, I think, don't want to do weightlifting exercises because they're hard to teach, right? But if we have an athlete who's skinny strong, they might not be the best squatter. They might not be the best, let's say, even bencher, right? And we're going to ignore movements like a snatch or a clean that are technically focused and that will help their nervous system play catch up. And that's a big factor that I think around being skinny strong, is that when you start to use those big movements that are fast, that have heavier load, think about Ryan cleaning 185 kilos, or Nick when he was in high school, he cleaned 160 kilos. That's 350 plus pounds. And you're pulling that at 1.5 meters per second. That's training your nervous system to fire and recruit really, really quickly. And so if you're also doing jumps and you're also doing hypertrophy work, now your nervous system, your brain, your spinal cord fires much more effectively. It's used to the speed. It's used to the co-contraction speed that is needed. That's why you take the skinny kid and you turn them into the absolute freak that has skinny strength. So my argument in the case of Ryan, the case of Nick, and in the case of all of these other skinny strong athletes, technique, high volume more than anyone else, and focus on nutrition. And ultimately, they've got to be doing a snatch or a clean. They've got to do that because that's going to lead them to become and recruit better and higher threshold motor units consistently. And I think the overarching factor is that they've got to get good at back squats early. Okay, you've got to get good at back squats at a young age when you're skinny. If you can get good at back squats at a young age when you're skinny, it will carry over to everything else. That's why someone like Ryan, who weighs 178 pounds, can front squat 212. Okay, when you can front squat 212 at 178 pounds, or 81 kilos, he's front squatting 450 to 460 pounds. He's still in high school. Those are unheard of numbers. So you can shy away from your weightlifting and you can do your trap bar jumps, but you're never going to be able to front squat that weight. And then if you can't front squat that weight, or you can't back squat that weight, your vertical jump's not going to be high enough. And that's a big factor. Looking at Brandon just hit a 42.5-inch vertical. He grew up in a cleaning system. He grew up snatching. He grew up hitting jerks. When he was in high school, he hit 160K behind the neck jerk. He had a 35-inch vert in high school because we use those fast movements. But the fast movements only happen after stability is imprinted. Okay, when you're skinny, stability is the big key. Technique is the huge key. And then after that, everything gets piled on, and that's the big factor around being skinny strong. That's a case study from Ryan McDonald, using examples of football players that are also skinny strong, swimmers that are also skinny strong, and that's what you need to develop over that long time frame. And don't forget that rep rate of improvement. We know what it takes to gain, how many reps you need to gain 10 pounds at each milestone, and so that also factors into adding in a little bit more volume so that they make that big progress. If you guys need help with your training, click the link down below in the description. Get inside Peak Strength. You're going to understand how we build this out and how you're going to make those huge gains over 6 months, 12 months, so that you can become a freak. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.